Cultural Relics Restorer vs. Cultural Relics Protection Police, Long Separation Reunion, Broken Mirror Reunion, Chasing After Wife Crematorium, Each Other in White Moonlight. In high school, there was a huge difference between Xu Chenyin and Xu Chenyin. Xu Chenyin was a dazzling star, while Xu Chenyin was the one who peeked at the stars. Xu Chenyin never imagined that the stars would actively rush towards her, but she lost them. Reunion. The once gentle young man has already transformed into a distant and indifferent person. With multiple intentional or unintentional work contacts, Xu Chenyin decides to be brave. Xu Chenyin said, "Xu Chenyin, can our relationship still go back to the past?" Xu Chenyin sneered coldly, "Do you think it's possible?" Feeling disheartened, Xu Chenyin chose to turn around and leave. Coincidentally, the repair work required an external transfer. She resolutely signed up, but as she left, Xu Chenyin came to the airport. Amidst the hustle and bustle of people, he whispered in panic, "Chenyin, don't leave." Hard-mouthed and passionate dog man versus quiet and introverted inner brave beauty. Keywords of the novel. Dark love story without pop-ups. Download the complete collection of Dark Love Story TXT, and read the latest chapters of Dark Love Story. Chapter 1. Reunion. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. Reunion. In early summer of June 2008. In the forbidden city of Beijing, there is continuous light rain, which drips onto the bluestone slabs and emits a crisp sound. "Chenyin, I can't finish it today, so I can do it tomorrow." A middle-aged man dressed in simple clothes walked up and said with a smile in his eyes, "There are not many young people like you who love antiques now. You need to take your time. The mysteries behind this are endless." Xu Chenyin stopped her movements and pursed her lips, saying, "Master, I want to finish repairing this bracelet today. You go first, I'll lock the door." Wei Ho smiled happily and said, "Don't worry, I'm waiting for you. In the evening, when the group gathers for dinner, I can also introduce you to them." Xu Chenyin smiled warmly, nodded, lowered her eyes, and at the moment when her hand touched the jade bracelet again, the story and last wish of the owner's life vividly came to her mind. This is a jade bracelet from the Qin dynasty. The owner of the bracelet is an unpopular empress. From the first step into the palace, what she most wants to see is the emperor. However, things are unpredictable, and from the most beautiful age until she grows old, she has not been able to fulfill her wish. "I can only see you sighing with joy." On her deathbed, as she had never been favored by the emperor throughout her life, even if she died, she was only buried and could not fulfill her wish. Only this jade bracelet brought from home accompanied her throughout her life. After closing her eyes and letting the scenes come to her mind, Xu Chenyin took a deep breath, opened her eyes, and gently touched the surface of the jade bracelet with her fingertips, feeling a bit sad. Originally in her youth, she was forced to enter the palace and waited for someone for her whole life, but in the end, she ended up regretful. The person she had spent her entire life waiting for may not have known her name from beginning to end. At first, Xu Chenyin resisted her ability to feel the stories and wishes of the former owner of the ancient object by touching it. However, as she gradually understood the stories and wishes of the owner behind the object, she began to feel it and gradually changed her mind. It is her honor to be able to perceive the past stories of history through touch. The crisp sound of raindrops tapping outside kept coming, and her face gradually became calm, just like the emotional hope in her heart at this moment, peaceful and tranquil. After a long time, Xu Chenyin finally put down her arms, stood up straight, extended her hands, and gently picked up the jade bracelet. Under soft lighting, this jade bracelet can be clearly seen with intricate and exquisite patterns carved on the back, each of which is lifelike. On the inner side of the jade bracelet, the word Chenyin is engraved. Xu Chenyin stared intently at the jade bracelet in her hand. After a moment, she withdrew her gaze and said to Wei Ho, "Master, I have finished it. Come and take a look." Upon hearing this, Wei Ho took the jade bracelet from her hand, carefully explored it, and then nodded repeatedly, "Not bad, I didn't take a glance, he's a good seedling. Xu Chenyin curved her lips and chuckled lightly, you taught me well. It has nothing to do with teaching me, it still depends on one's patience and love. Along the way, Wei Ho taught her various experiences until they arrived at the hot pot restaurant where they were having a meal. Wei Ho stopped talking and instead proudly introduced himself to the people in the private room, saying, "This is my disciple, Xu Chenyin." "How is it?" Xu Chenyin bowed slightly and said, "Hello everyone, I am Xu Chenyin. I hope you can give me more guidance in the future. Welcome." As soon as she finished speaking, a burst of cheers echoed in the private room. Then one of the men, who was about the same age as Wei Ho, exclaimed, "How many years have we not added any fresh blood to our profession?" "Master, I've only been here for a year." Jiang Yu mercilessly exposed her master's words and waved at Xu Chenyin, saying, "Chenyin, come here. We have something to talk about and gossip." Xu Chenyin glanced at Wei Ho and waited for his signal. Go on, go on. You and Xiaoyu are sitting together, having more topics than us elderly people." After Duke Wei finished speaking, the man just now nodded repeatedly, "Yes, the old man is looking for the old man, and the young man is looking for the young man. This way, no one is constrained." After speaking, everyone in the private room became noisy again, and Xu Chenyin also smiled and came to Jiang Yu's side. She thought Jiang Yu was saying polite things, but she didn't realize that from the moment she sat next to Jiang Yu's mouth never stopped. From history to entertainment gossip, there was nothing Jiang Yu didn't know. She wanted to interject midway, but it all ended in failure. "By the way, Chenyin, why did you choose this major?" Upon hearing this question, Xu Chenyin's eyes flickered slightly, and she couldn't help but think of someone in her mind. She whispered, "Because of a promise with someone." "Who is it?" Jiang Yu asked subconsciously. Xu Chenyin lowered her eyelids and concealed her emotions. After a while, she slowly spoke up, "My ex-boyfriend." Upon hearing her answer, Jiang Yu instantly realized something was wrong and quickly made up for it. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ask that. I just thought you, like me, chose this industry for the sake of family talent." "It's okay," Xu Chenyin raised her eyes again and pursed her lips with a smile. Jiang Yu nodded and smiled awkwardly, then changed the topic. "Do you want to go to the bathroom together?" "Okay," Xu Chenyin nodded. Everyone in the private room was chatting passionately, completely devoid of time to pay attention to the small movements of the two of them. Arriving at the bathroom, Xu Chenyin just stood in front of the faucet, washed her hands, and then went out to wait for Jiang Yu. Watching the bustling corridor, she leaned against the wall and couldn't help but think of Jiang Yu's previous topic in her mind, stunned. When Jiang Yu came out, she looked excited and said, "Chenyin, I just washed my hands and saw a particularly handsome guy. Let's wait and see if we can get to WeChat." Xu Chenyin remained silent and waited with her. "Coming out. Coming out." Jiang Yuzheng was speaking as a thin man walked out. He was wearing a black T-shirt, with cold and stern eyebrows and eyes, clean and sharp facial lines, and thin lips tightly pursed. He looked cold and indifferent all over. Xu Chenyin glanced up. The man's gaze fell right down. In an instant, the four eyes met. Time seems to stop at this moment. Xu Chenyin's breath suddenly tightened, her eyes not blinking. Unfortunately, Jiang Yu didn't notice anything wrong and said shyly, "Handsome guy, can you add a WeChat account?" However, the man just gave her a faint glance without any hesitation and took steps to leave. As the man passed her by, Xu Chenyin clearly saw a scar on his eyebrow bone that he didn't have in high school, as well as a slight bitterness of tobacco on his body. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Meeting. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2 Meeting. When she returned to the private room, Xu Chenyin was in a state of restlessness, and even what Duke Wei had said to her was only heard by her for the third time. Chenyin, the Tang dynasty cultural relic golden hu bottle was stolen, and it was feared that the cultural relic would be damaged again during the theft process. Therefore, I was sent to accompany the cultural relic police to Dulin County this time. After the cultural relic police recover the cultural relic, we need to stay in the local area to repair it before returning. Do you want to go? It will take a month to completely repair it, and Dulin County is also a temperate desert area. Chenyin, you need to think carefully, Jiang Yu reminded softly. When preparing to enter this industry, Xu Chenyin was prepared to face everything, so when facing the question of Duke Wei, she nodded firmly and said, I will go with my master. Duke Wei smiled with relief and said, I didn't see anyone wrong. Jiang Yu smiled at her and said, Great, Chenyin. Xu Chenyin smiled warmly, but her mind was still floating with the figure of Ji Yen. After the party, when Xu Chenyin took the subway back to the apartment, it was already 10 o'clock in the evening. Pushing the door open, what caught the eye was pitch black. She didn't turn on the light and came to the bedside by the moonlight. Her gaze fell on the photo frame placed on the bedside table, which was the only photo she had with Ji Yen. Xu Chenyin picked up the photo frame and carefully studied Ji Yan's youth, slowly recalling the scene from earlier in her mind. The once gentle youth seemed to have changed a lot, especially in those black eyes, no longer the faint smile of the past, now filled with indifference. Before her high school years, due to family reasons, she was insecure and once thought that the sky was gray. This situation persisted until her high school years, when she thought that high school life would continue to be a little transparent. But Ji Yen was like a beam of light breaking into her dark world, taking her slowly out of her inferiority complex, repeatedly encouraging her until she completely broke free from the dark world. It can be said that Ji Yen is the gentlest person she has ever seen. It is also the existence of the white moonlight in her heart. Xu Chenyin, why are you so stupid? Xu Chenyin, look at me. Chenyin, shall we be together? At this moment, Xu Chenyin's mind was filled with various sounds, all of which were words he had said to her before. He is always so gentle, but she still lost him. After separating from Ji Yen in high school, she was taken abroad by her mother until a year ago, when she first chose to resist her mother's arrangement and chose to return to her home country. She wanted to find Ji Yen, even if the other party might have already forgotten her, even if the hope was slim, she still wanted to give it a try. Just today, unexpectedly, she saw Ji Yen again. She had fantasized about many scenes of reuniting with Ji Yen in her mind, but never thought it would be like today. He brushed past her, but completely regarded her as a stranger, seeing no mistake or surprise in his eyes, no joy, not even ridicule. She doesn't know, did Ji Yen really forget her? Still hating her for leaving without saying goodbye, can she still see him again? Thinking of this, Xu Chenyin looked up at the night outside the window and was stunned for a long time. When we arrived in Dulin County, it was noon and the sun was shining on us, making us suffocated. Marquis Wei was already accustomed to this kind of environment. He glanced at Xu Chenyin, who was silently following him, and comforted, our work has a special nature. Let's get used to it slowly. We'll be fine when we see the cultural relics. Xu Chenyin shook her head and pursed her lips with a light smile, I'm fine, master. Wei Ho smiled and talked to her about some cultural relics along the way. The golden hu bottle was unearthed from the hot water tomb group in Dulin County, representing the Qinghai region and absorbing cultural factors from the Central Plains and light, thus forming its own distinctive characteristics. Moreover, the hot water tomb is the prototype of the well-known 9-story demon tower, which was actually a Tuyuhan royal tomb at that time. When the two of them arrived at the hotel, it was almost 1 o'clock in the afternoon. After receiving their room cards, Xu Chenyin's first thing when she returned to her room was to take a shower. When she first came out, the door of the room was gently knocked on, and the voice of Duke Wei came in. Chenyin, have you packed up? The Cultural Relics Police want to talk to us about cultural relics. Xu Chenyin quickly responded, okay, we'll be here soon. On the way to the restaurant, Marquis Wei occasionally comforted her with a few words, and Xu Chenyin's face also wore a warm smile, responding with every word. Dulin County is not big, and it only took 10 minutes from the hotel to the restaurant. When he arrived at the entrance of the restaurant, a man in police uniform walked up and asked, "Is it from the Cultural Relics Restoration Bureau?" Duke Wei nodded and introduced, "I am Duke Wei, and this is my disciple, Xu Chenyin." The police officer smiled and said, "Let's go. Captain Ji heard that the people from your Cultural Relics Bureau are back today and has been busy receiving you all morning." Captain Ji. Upon hearing this surname, Xu Chenyin felt a thump in her heart. But then she denied from the bottom of her heart that it was probably just the same surname. Whenever she heard about Ji Yan, it was easy for her to associate too much. Although she had been trying to persuade herself like this in her heart, following the police officer, Xu Chenyin still couldn't control her wild thoughts. Xu Chenyin, who had been immersed in her own world all the way, did not notice that the Marquis of Wei occasionally looked at her with a worried expression in his eyes. "Captain, the repair team has arrived." As the door of the private room was pushed open, Xu Chenyin couldn't help feeling nervous in her heart. Just lifting her eyes, Xu Chenyin suddenly stopped and her gaze fell on the man standing by the window in the private room, frozen in place and unable to say anything. The scorching sunlight outside the window refracted through the glass and entered the private room. The man's facial features were three-dimensional, his nose was straight, his thin lips were tightly pursed, and his whole body emitted a cold sensation that was thousands of miles away. Xu Chenyin's heart was convulsing violently, and she gritted her lips tightly to restrain her expression and maintain composure. "This is our season team," Zhou Yang explained without noticing anything wrong. "Please take a seat, time is limited, and we will try to discuss the outcome as soon as possible." Xu Chenyin didn't move, just fixed her gaze on the man in front of her. The waves in her eyes were turbulent, but she couldn't say a word. "Chenyin." Wei Ho noticed her mistake and asked with concern, "Are you feeling unwell? If you're unwell, you can go back to the hotel first." Xu Chenyin shook her head, but her gaze still remained fixed on the man. No one knows how anxious she is now. Perhaps her gaze was too persistent, and Zhou Yang finally realized something was wrong. He looked at Ji Yan and asked, "Captain, do you know each other?" "Recognize?" "I don't know, it's my first time meeting." Ji Yan, who had been silent all along, suddenly spoke up. His black eyes seemed to be staring at the person in front of him, his long black hair tied in a ponytail, and his bangs scattered down his forehead to block his eyebrows. His delicate features were slightly pink, clean and refreshing, but also carried a faint sense of alienation. He raised his eyebrows, stood up, and politely extended his right hand, saying, "Hello, Ji Yan, responsible for the search for cultural relics this time." End of this chapter. Chapter 3. Delay. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. Delay. Xu Chenyin's gaze slowly shifted downwards and landed on the man's well-defined big hand. After a while, she couldn't regain her senses. "Did you really forget about her? Do you still hate her and intentionally say that?" Ji Yan didn't wait for her response, and his face didn't show much emotion. He calmly withdrew his hand and looked at Duke Wei, nodding slightly. "Next, let me introduce to you the current whereabouts of the Golden Hu bottle and the extent of its damage." Duke Wei nodded and patted Xu Chenyin's shoulder, saying, "Chenyin, if you're feeling unwell, don't hold on. There's a master here, you don't have to worry." Xu Chenyin's mind was in a state of turmoil, but she didn't want to leave. She shook her head and whispered, "Master, it's okay with me." Seeing her so persistent, Duke Wei didn't say much and could only ask her to sit down. During this period, Ji Yan didn't even glance at him again. But Xu Chenyin's gaze was cautious, and this feeling made her feel like she was back in high school, hiding in a corner and secretly watching Ji Yan stand in the crowd, shining brightly. Now Ji Yan is also the most dazzling. Our police have had interactions with the tomb robbers before, but that team has a strong anti-reconnaissance awareness. In addition, they are now hiding in the deep mountains, and the police's search power needs to be strengthened. Ji Yan said, taking a glance at Xu Chenyin. 2 seconds later, he withdrew his gaze and continued, it may take a long time. During this process, the golden Hu bottle may be damaged again by humans, and we will have to trouble you and your disciple. I don't know if Xu Chenyin's nerves are too tense when it comes to the 2 words, disciple. She always feels that Ji Yan deliberately bit these 2 words too hard. Zhou Yang sat next to Ji Yan, looking at Xu Chenyin across from him and then at Ji Yan. No matter how he looked, he could smell an unusual smell. Their captain, usually such a gentle person, always deliberately pretends to be cold in front of this girl. If it's too fake, you can also deceive this girl. Chenyin, Chenyin. Wei Ho called Xu Chenyin 3 times before receiving a response. What's wrong with Master? Duke Wei asked helplessly, do you have anything else to say to Captain Ji? What did you say to Ji Yan? Xu Chenyin looked at Ji Yan with a hesitant expression. At this moment, Ji Yan's gaze also fell on her, with a businesslike attitude. 4 eyes facing each other. Xu Chenyin took the lead in defeating the battle, lowered her eyes, and gradually tightened her grip on the mineral water bottle until the bottle made a faint sound before she struggled to murmur, it's okay. That's all for today. If you, master and disciple, need any help from me and my colleagues, please feel free to contact us at any time. Ji Yan finished speaking and stood up. I have something else to do, and my colleagues will continue to entertain you. I'm sorry. Xu Chenyin stiffened her body and sat in a chair, listening to the door of the private room being opened and closed, her heart uncontrollably following her as she left. This batch of cultural relics has a large quantity and a value that exceeds our expectations. After receiving the news, the city leaders attach great importance to it. Zhou Yang said, hesitating for a moment. Seeing Xu Chenyin's absence, he asked, Miss Xu, if you're feeling unwell, can I ask our captain to take you back? Yes, Chenyin. If you're feeling unwell, don't hold on. Anyway, today is just a simple communication session, said Duke Wei. Upon hearing this, Xu Chenyin pursed her lips and couldn't ignore her thoughts. She nodded and said, that would trouble Captain Ji. What's the trouble? Zhou Yang smiled and said, and our captain is not afraid of trouble the most. Upon hearing his words, Xu Chenyin couldn't help but be slightly distracted. Yes, Ji Yan was not afraid of trouble the most. Otherwise, why would he have come to her, a troublemaker, without hesitation to help her solve all her troubles? Just I'm afraid. She's really troublesome for Ji Yan now. Xu Chenyin thought and wanted to say a word of rejection, and the door of the private room was also opened again at this moment. It was less than 10 minutes before Ji Yan Gang left. Are you feeling unwell? Ji Yan stared at her quietly and asked in a voice. Xu Chenyin tensed her nerves and let out a sound. Feeling his gaze scrutinizing, Xu Chenyin's nervousness became increasingly evident in her heart. In the past, whenever she lied, she would be seen through by him without exception. After a long time, Ji Yan finally spoke up and said coldly, let's go. Along the way, I'll take you back. Xu Chenyin let out a low, sound, followed by a few words of advice from Marquis Wei, and then quickly took steps to keep up with Ji Yan's footsteps. The sun in Dulan is very strong, even though it is almost past the afternoon, the air is still stuffy and breathless. Xu Chenyin followed behind Ji Yan without saying a word. Whenever she tried to get close to him, he would quietly distance her away, not far or close, yet he could just help her block the scorching sunlight. Xu Chenyin noticed this, but couldn't be sure. She could only occasionally look up at him with a worried expression on her face. Until she returned to the hotel entrance, just as Ji Yan was about to turn around, she mustered up the courage to say, Ji Yan. Is there anything else? Ji Yan stopped and turned to look at her without changing his expression. Xu Chenyin reached out and tugged at his sleeve, nervously asking, over the years. Are you okay? Ji Yan withdrew from his hem and responded faintly. Is that so? Xu Chenyin lowered her head, curled her fingertips into a fist, and bit her lip, saying, I'm sorry about what happened back then, Ji Yan's eyes suddenly paused, he didn't turn around, his back still straight, and his voice clear and low-pitched. No need, and Xu Chenyin, you're really not suitable for lying. After speaking, he walked away without any lingering feelings. Xu Chenyin closed her eyes and tried to adjust her emotions. That night, as she was strolling back to the hotel after dinner with Duke Wei, he suddenly asked, Chenyin, do you know Captain Ji? Xu Chenyin's expression paused and she nodded lightly, I know each other. When we were children. We spent time together. Marquis Wei was somewhat surprised and said, is that right? That's quite a coincidence. Both of you are still engaged in the cultural relics industry. If you restore and protect them, Master thinks you two have a good fate. Xu Chenyin forced a smile, her eyes flickering with a sense of disappointment, but she didn't respond. Upon seeing her expression, Marquis Wei didn't delve into the matter and changed the topic. How are you preparing for the information and repair work of the Golden Hu bottle? When it came to work, Xu Chenyin finally regained her composure and slowly said, we have almost prepared everything. The Golden Hu bottle is slender and thin, with a plain face, extravagant mouth, thin neck, bulging belly, and round feet, all made by pounding. G team, we have received accurate information from above, let's take immediate action tonight. Have you contacted the person from the Cultural Relics Bureau? Not yet. Zhou Yang followed behind Ji Yan, his gaze touching the master and disciple standing below the steps. He stopped speaking and turned his gaze to look at Ji Yan, the people are here. The evening breeze was gently blowing at this moment, and Xu Chenyin couldn't help but turn her gaze towards Ji Yan. Her breath was momentarily delayed, just silently watching him. Where did you go? Why did your phone shut down? Ji Yan asked two questions in a row, which made Xu Chenyin a bit confused. She slightly opened her lips and was about to speak when Ji Yan's voice said coldly, Xu Chenyin, don't delay everyone's work progress because of yourself. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Motivation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4 Motivation. Zhou Yang felt that the captain's words were a bit heavy, so he quickly reconciled and smiled, Miss Xu, don't worry. Our team is just worried about you, after all, Dulan is not safe until night. Xu Chenyin shook her head and changed the topic. Are you going out? Upon receiving the instructions above, the tomb raiding team will take action tonight, Zhou Yang said, adding, not only us, but also your master and disciples. If the operation goes smoothly tonight, you should try your best to avoid causing the cultural relics to be damaged again. Regarding this, Xu Chenyin was a bit caught off guard, but Marquis Wei had already become accustomed to it. Seeing her slightly surprised appearance, she asked with concern, Chenyin, can you? Before Xu Chenyin could answer, Ji Yan took the lead in saying, since I have chosen this industry, there is nothing I can say. He said, raised his wrist and glanced at the time, without any tone. He continued, can you come out in 5 minutes? Xu Chenyin was momentarily stunned, but when she saw his cold gaze, she suddenly nodded and ran towards the hotel. As she passed by, Xu Chenyin smelled the faint bitter smoke on his body. Seeing their master and disciple leave, Zhou Yang curiously asked, Captain, why are you so hostile towards Miss Xu? Ji Yan glanced at him, his voice neither cold nor faint, and said, you think too much, I treat everyone like this. Zhou Yang pouted. He didn't believe it and didn't dare to refute it. After all, although their captain was usually gentle, anyone who committed a crime would not be lenient when punished. When Xu Chenyin ran out with the toolbox, before she could catch her breath, the toolbox was taken away by Ji Yan. Facing her bewildered Xingmo, Ji Yan explained expressionlessly, "You're already 2 minutes late, don't make everyone wait for you." Upon hearing this, Xu Chenyin quickly nodded and followed him step by step, not daring to slack off. However, when she got on the car, Xu Chenyin made a mistake. Duke Wei was led by Zhou Yang into another car. As soon as she wanted to follow, she met Zhou Yang's smiling face and said, "Miss Xu is fully booked. You can go follow Ji's team." Xu Chenyin pursed her lips and watched as Zhou Yang drove away before turning to look at Ji Yan and whispering, "I have to follow you." Ji Yan sat in the driver's seat, lifting his eyelids to look at her without saying a word. The temperature difference between daytime and nighttime in Dulin County is significant. At this moment, the evening wind blows and disrupts her hair hanging by her ear, revealing half of her snow-white and pink neck. Ji Yan's gaze was deep and his voice was slightly cold. "Are you ready to stand on the cultural relic and return it to your hands?" Xu Chenyin was taken aback, then quickly bent down and tightly grasped the inside of the car. After she fastened her seatbelt, the car also started. Along the way, there was silence in the car. Xu Chenyin clasped her hands on her knees and occasionally looked up at Ji Yan, who was driving beside her. She wanted to say something, but every time she touched Ji Yan's cold expression, she lowered her eyes. The car drove very fast all the way, and Dulin County was not very big. In half an hour, the car arrived at its destination. The destination is a desert. Under the illumination of the car lights, the surroundings can only be barely seen clearly. When a person steps on the desert, their footprints are quickly submerged by the quicksand, which without exception adds another difficulty to the search task. Zhou Yang frowned and said, "Team G, driving in the desert is actually a drag. We divided into 2 paths, one driving to intercept and the other carrying tools. Our actions were obstructed, and they were in the same situation. They should take action immediately now." Ji Yan finished speaking and turned to look at Xu Chenyin, his tone not to refuse, saying, "You come with me." Upon hearing this, Xu Chenyin's face showed a hint of embarrassment. Duke Wei saw what she was thinking and comforted her, saying, "Chenyin, believe in yourself. You can already do the basic repair work very well." Xu Chenyin still felt a bit uneasy in her heart, but time didn't wait, so she could only grit her head and nod. The 2 teams quickly dispersed, and Xu Chenyin took a deep breath. Just as she was about to take a step, a big palm with distinct joints suddenly appeared in front of her. Xu Chenyin looked up at him without knowing why. "The quicksand traps people, can you walk on your own?" Ji Yan's tone was faint, as if it were an ordinary question. Xu Chenyin hesitated for a moment before gently placing her hand on his. In an instant, her hand was tightly held, and a constant stream of warmth came from it. This familiar feeling made her feel a momentary daze, as if time had regressed back to high school. "His back is as straight as before, but different from before." In the eyes he looked at her, there was no smile, no liking thinking of this. Xu Chenyin lowered her eyelashes and looked at the intersecting hands of the 2, letting the attachment in her eyes flow out. Her fingertips slowly curled up until their hands pressed tightly against each other. Sensing her movements, Ji Yan's black eyes paused slightly but remained silent. "The wind and sand blinded my eyes, and my movements were inevitably hindered." About half an hour later, Zhou Yang's shout suddenly came from the walkie-talkie. "Ji team, I saw the trail of those people and they are running towards your direction." As soon as Zhou Yang finished speaking, several dim yellow lights and several panicked figures came from not far away. "Captain, it should be just a few of them," one of the police officers said with a happy expression on his face. As usual, when dealing with the opponent, cultural relics should be given priority. Ji Yan calmly ordered, "Take action." The other police officers nodded one after another and chased after the panicked figures ahead. The night breeze became increasingly rapid, making people unable to open their eyes. Xu Chenyin clenched her fists tightly to resist the wind and tried to maintain her balance. Ji Yan's speed was faster than Xu Chenyin's. He was in front and Xu Chenyin was behind. In just a few seconds, they fell apart. Xu Chenyin's physical strength was clearly struggling. She bit her lips and desperately chased after Ji Yan. At this moment, Ji Yan suddenly stopped and turned to look at her, standing here waiting, you can't go anywhere, you know. Xu Chenyin let out a and quickly hugged the toolbox in his arms, afraid that it would fall off. However, the next second, before she could breathe a sigh of relief, the quicksand under her feet suddenly relaxed uncontrollably, and she followed suit as she sank in. Ji Yan grabbed her arm and pulled it to the side. Only a second later, Xu Chenyin was scared out of a cold sweat. Looking at Ji Yan again, he stared expressionlessly ahead, not knowing what he was thinking. Xu Chenyin. For a long time, he looked down at her with a serious expression and said, "Do you still have the strength to run?" Xu Chenyin didn't dare to delay a minute or a second, so she quickly nodded and said, "Sure." Ji Yan let out a in his voice, raised his hand to help her lift the broken hair behind her ear, didn't ask further, took the toolbox, and held on to her tightly with the other hand, running against the wind. The wind lifted the tail of her hair, and Xu Chenyin looked up at him with an indescribable feeling in her heart. She felt that even without the past, she would still be attracted to Ji Yan again at this moment. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. I really want to. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. I really want to. The two teams intercepted the group of people together, and soon they were forced to a dead end. One of the chubby people spoke up first, "Don't come over again, be careful, I'll take this bottle and die together." "Which do you choose, 3 years or 10 years?" Ji Yan said with a faint tone. "Oh my God, I don't choose anything," the fat man said angrily. "Did you persuade people like that?" Ji Yan's face didn't show any waves. "Do you think you can still run now? The golden Hu bottle is not porcelain, and now that we are all in a desert, you have no right to negotiate with me." I. The chubby guy stuttered for a while, unable to say a negative word, and in the end, could only summarize one sentence. "Why don't you play cards according to the routine?" Thanks to him preparing a bunch of words. Ji Yanma spoke in a cold voice, "Now stand still and remain silent." After saying this, Ji Yan glanced at Zhou Yang, who nodded slightly and walked towards the group of chubby people. "Can I consider myself surrendering? Will I receive some leniency?" "Can be considered." The fat man asked, and as Zhou Yang relaxed his guard, he suddenly punched him and cursed, "Slim, why don't you run for me?" Zhou Yang narrowly avoided it on his side, but allowed a thin and frail man behind the fat man to take advantage and run away. "Captain." Ji Yan frowned and quickly chased after the skinny guy. But in the blink of an eye, the skinny guy was caught up and knocked down by Ji Yan, then got up again, lifted his fist, and engaged in a fight with Ji Yan. Ji Yan first dodged backwards, and when the skinny man punched again, he raised his hand and grabbed the arm that the skinny man was swinging, then pressed him to the ground with his backhand. The whole process is crisp and neat. Accompanied by the thin man's muffled groans, he deliberately threw away the golden Hu bottle in his arms. Ji Yan wanted to grab it, but slowed down a step. As Ji Yan was about to speak, he looked up and saw a slender figure chasing after the rolling golden Hu bottle, ignoring the quicksand. Ji Yan's pupils suddenly contracted, without even thinking, and he immediately caught up. Xu Chenyin. After seeing Ji Yan's actions, Zhou Yang was stunned for a moment, but when he saw the thin guy's movements, he immediately reacted and rushed forward to suppress the thin guy again. He went back and shouted loudly, "Why don't you go help the captain yet?" Xu Chenyin chased after the rolling golden Hu bottle, running and reaching out to grab it, but every time it was almost there. Even though her fingertips were bloodstained by the sand, she still dared not stop, afraid of missing the opportunity. Seeing the golden Hu bottle about to collide with a protruding stone in the desert, Xu Chenyin's heart tightened and she rushed over without even thinking. Hiss. Xu Chenyin's painful face turned pale for a moment, but she did not forget to firmly hold the golden ancient vase in her arms. Xu Chenyin. Ji Yan chased after her and saw Xu Chenyin lying in an extremely awkward position. His eyebrows furrowed fiercely, his eyes darkened, and he quickened his pace to step forward, pulling her up and tightly embracing her in his arms. Xu Chenyin was taken aback and quietly felt the strong heartbeat in his chest. After a while, she comforted him softly, Ji Yan, I'm fine. What else do you want? Ji Yan slowly let go of her and his gaze fell on her blood-stained 10 fingers. His voice was deep and hoarse, Xu Chenyin, do you understand the danger just now? I understand. Xu Chenyin lowered her eyes and looked at the golden Hu bottle in her arms, murmuring, but the situation was too sudden just now. If I don't catch up, the golden Hu bottle will only suffer 2 major injuries. She paused before continuing, Ji Yan, there is a story behind every former owner of a cultural relic. I don't want them to suffer any harm again. Ji Yan pursed his thin lips and looked deeply at her for a moment before saying again, can we still leave? Can. After Xu Chenyin finished speaking, as she was about to take a step, she looked at him with some embarrassment and said, it's just that she might walk a bit slowly. Just now, she noticed that she seemed to have hit her waist. Ji Yan frowned and didn't respond. She just walked up to Xu Chenyin and, under Xu Chenyin's stunned gaze, slowly squatted down with a flat voice. Come up. Can. There isn't that much, but don't delay the repair time. Ji Yan spoke firmly and couldn't refuse. Xu Chenyin hesitated for a moment, but eventually obediently leaned on her back, her movements very restrained. Ji Yan still had no expression on his face. He held her up, stood up, spread his long legs, and walked straight forward. After walking for 10 minutes, Xu Chenyin greedily watched Ji Yan for 10 minutes, not reluctant to look away. She couldn't help but think of the bits and pieces of summer vacation in her sophomore year. Their first hand in hand, their first embrace, were all during the summer vacation of that year, and the acceleration of their heartbeat is still unforgettable to her. Perhaps her eyes were too hot, and Ji Yan's eyes dimmed as he spoke up and asked, do your hands still hurt? Upon hearing his caring voice, Xu Chenyin paused before answering, it doesn't hurt anymore. Then came another moment of silence. Xu Chenyin pursed her lips and looked at his sharp-side face, hesitating to speak. She had many questions to ask him, but she was afraid that Ji Yan would get bored. After all, their relationship is no longer the same as before. By the time Ji Yan returned with Xu Chenyin on his back, Zhou Yang had already teamed up with several other team members to control the chubby and skinny two. As soon as Zhou Yang was about to report something, he looked up and was stunned by the scene before him, unable to speak. Good guy, if we talk about the captain denying his relationship with Miss Su before, he can still barely believe it, but now, even if we train him to death, he doesn't believe it. However, in shock, Zhou Yang remained steadfast in his report until the end, when he tentatively asked, Captain, how are we going? I'll go with my master. Xu Chenyin deliberately avoided Zhou Yang's glances and whispered, struggling to get off Ji Yan's body. Don't move, Ji Yan said in a low voice before looking at Duke Wei in a gentle tone. Master Wei, you can go back with my colleague first. I'll take her with me. It should be a bit late and we need to go to the hospital. Is Chenyin injured? Then go to the hospital and have a look. I'm here for the repair work, so don't worry, Wei Ho repeatedly reminded with concern. Xu Chenyin opened her mouth, perhaps with her own selfish intentions. She wanted to stay with Ji Yan for a while longer, but in the end, she nodded. After separating from Zhou Yang and the others, the surroundings once again fell silent. In the desolate desert, it seemed like only the two of them were left at this moment. A gust of cold wind blew by, and Xu Chenyin couldn't help but shrink her body. The wings of her nose were suddenly filled with the unique scent of sunlight on his body, which made her heart beat violently. She pursed her lips tightly, and after countless cheers in her heart, she dared to speak softly, "Ji Yan, I miss you so much in these years. I really want to." I think of a time when she had to rely on medication to ensure sleep. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Don't Show Me Again. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. Don't Show Me Again. Time seems incredibly long at this moment. Darkness enveloped his face, blurry, making it difficult for Xu Chenyin to see his emotions at the moment. The wind seemed to have been blowing for a long time, until Xu Chenyin's heart sank heavily. When she wanted to say something, she heard Ji Yan's silent voice say, "Don't say such things in the future." Xu Chenyin's apricot eyes flickered slightly, and she closed them before barely suppressing the feeling of sadness and disappointment. Silent all the way, when she arrived at the hospital, it was Ji Yan who was busy with everything for her, while she only needed to go to the doctor's office. The traffic at night in the county hospital was not high, so it wasn't long before it was Xu Chenyin's turn. "Will you wait for me?" Before entering, Xu Chenyin turned to look at Ji Yan. "Well, let's go in," Ji Yan responded. With his assurance, Xu Chenyin finally let go and walked into the office. She was not seriously injured, so the doctor gave a few ordinary warnings, but when she came out, Ji Yan's figure could not be seen. The fear of separation surged into Xu Chenyin's heart again, and she couldn't help but panic. Ignoring the pain in her waist, she turned around and ran down the hospital corridor. As she ran out of the hospital gate, a gust of wind happened to raise her hair, and the sound of an ambulance honking nearby forced her to stop. "Let go." Two nurses were anxiously pushing the moving bed forward, while a bloody man lay on top. At this moment, the man was lying on the bed, occasionally gushing blood from his mouth. "Sir, don't sleep, stay awake." As Xu Chenyin listened to the nurse's voice gradually fade away, she pursed her lips and was about to retract her gaze when she heard one of the nurses exclaim in surprise, "Just now, my heart rate is gone, and my pupils are dilated. Dr. Li." As the nurse's voice completely disappeared, Xu Chenyin lowered her eyelashes, concealing the complex emotions hidden in her eyes. Xu Chenyin. At this moment, Ji Yan appeared in front of her at some point, separated by a staircase. Looking up at her. The dim light at night reflected his towering figure even more majestic, and he stood still like a pine tree, his gaze fixed. Xu Chenyin was stunned and suddenly forgot all the reactions. Seeing that she didn't react, Ji Yan frowned and walked forward, looking down at her from a high position. He called out her name again, "Xu Chenyin." "Ji Yan." Xu Chenyin regained his senses and fixed his gaze on him, his eyes turning red. Ji Yan stared at her quietly for a moment before asking, "What's wrong? Where have you been?" Xu Chenyin bit her lips, trying to restrain the feeling of rolling in her heart. After a long time, she struggled and said, "I thought I wouldn't see you again." Ji Yan stared at her, his pitch-black eyes like a cold pond, deep and profound. "Xu Chenyin, you left first. So now she's saying this sentence again, it's simply ridiculous." Xu Chenyin opened her mouth and wanted to explain something, but when it came to her mouth, it could only be reduced to a simple and powerless, "I'm sorry," 3 words. "There's nothing I'm sorry for. I've forgotten everything from the past," Ji Yan said, lowering her head to take out a box of cigarettes from her pocket, pulling out one, lighting it on her lips, taking 2 sips before looking at Xu Chenyin. She said calmly, "From now on, don't show up in front of me again." Amidst the smoke, his face was shrouded in mist, but every word he said was like a sharp knife piercing into Xu Chenyin's heart. Xu Chenyin stood in place, staring blankly at him, his mind buzzing in his ears sounding more like sudden deafness. He couldn't hear any sound, except for Ji Yan's sentence, from now on, don't appear in front of me again. Ji Yan lowered his eyes and looked at her pale face. His gaze was calm and distant, without any waves. He continued, Xu Chenyin, your appearance has once again disrupted my life. Ji Yan. Xu Chenyin whispered his name, but couldn't say a complete sentence. Let's go, I'll take you back. After Ji Yan finished speaking, he extinguished his cigarette but in the nearby trash can and walked away without looking back. Xu Chenyin stood in the same place in a daze, watching him leave without any attachment. Suddenly, a huge sense of sadness surged in her heart. Seeing that she hadn't followed her, Ji Yan's eyes darkened. He turned around and his gaze fell on her. After looking at her for a moment, his Adam's apple moved slightly and his voice became slightly dry, saying, Aren't you leaving? Xu Chenyin's spine stiffened, and under his gaze, she took slow steps and sat behind him in the passenger seat, gazing out the window at the scene speeding by, with countless thoughts. Suddenly, a bell rang, appearing particularly abrupt in the sufficiently quiet carriage. Xu Chenyin looked at the caller ID and hesitated for a moment, then pressed the screen to turn off and hung up the call. Ji Yan glanced at her silently. Until the car stopped steadily at the entrance of the hotel, Xu Chenyin didn't rush to get off the car. She just lowered her eyes, took a deep breath, mustered up courage, and whispered, Ji Yan, there will be many unexpected accidents in life. I don't want to leave any regrets between us, so I apologize for what you just said. As she spoke, her hand hanging on her side tightened, then she lifted her eyes and met his gaze, slowly saying, I may not be able to comply. For eyes are facing each other, and both sides have complex emotions in their eyes. After a while, Ji Yan's expression remained indifferent and he took the lead in saying, Get off the car. Xu Chenyin's eyes flickered slightly, without stopping any longer. After watching his car disappear, Xu Chenyin chuckled and turned to enter the hotel. That night, Xu Chenyin lost sleep. As soon as she closed her eyes, all that came to her mind was Ji Yan's indifferent gaze. The next day, when I woke up, the sky was gloomy, with a hint of gray. Just like her mood, feeling frustrated and uneasy. When Duke Wei saw her, his concern couldn't stop in his eyes. Chenyin, young people don't need to work so hard. If you still feel uncomfortable, then take an extra day off. There is a master in the repair work. Xu Chenyin shook her head and insisted, I'm fine, master. Don't delay the repair work because of me. Seeing her like this, Marquis Wei didn't say much, so he had to take her away and gently admonished, this golden Hu vase is different from porcelain. It requires more patience. When repairing it, you must completely forget your personal emotions, you know. Thinking of Ji Yan again, the light in Xu Chenyin's eyes slightly dimmed. She took a soft breath in her heart and nodded, Master, I understand. Marquis Wei smiled with relief and explained some knowledge to her. The tomb group unearthed from the Jin Hu vase is an important discovery in archaeological research, and it is also the first time we have mastered the basic characteristics of the shape of the Tuyuhun tomb. Listening to the story about the golden Hu bottle, Xu Chenyin's confusion slowly dissipated and she focused on the repair work. Unconsciously, the sky was getting late. Until a sudden bell rang, the thoughts of the master and disciple were finally pulled back. Looking at the contact person on the screen, Duke Wei remained calm and handed his phone to Xu Chenyin, saying, It's Captain Ji. Chenyin, go pick it up. I'll finish the last step of today. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Previous Agreements. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7 Previous Agreements. Pressing the answer button, Ji Yan's voice slowly came out. Master Wei, my family still has something to do and I need to go back to Beijing first. My colleagues and you will take over the rest of the work. He finished speaking, but didn't receive a reply from Duke Wei on the phone. He couldn't help but think that the signal was bad and asked, Master Wei, can you hear me? Ji Yan, it's me. Xu Chenyin's voice suddenly came out, and Ji Yan was completely stunned on the other end of the phone, hesitating to speak again. Time seemed to have passed for a long time. Just as Xu Chenyin was about to speak, he heard Ji Yan's voice say coldly, "Xu Chenyin, I didn't joke with you that night." Xu Chenyin curled her fingertips slightly beside her and whispered, 1 second before he hung up the phone, she confidently asked, "Ji Yan, when are you leaving?" On the phone, Ji Yan didn't answer her question and just said in a low voice, "If it's okay, I'll hang up." "Captain, flight." At the moment when the phone hung up, Xu Chenyin heard Zhou Yang's voice clearly. "Is the flight tonight?" Before Xu Chenyin could think more, her body had already made a choice. When she returned to the studio, she happened to meet Wei Ho, who had finished work. After returning her phone to Wei Ho, she turned around and ran away quickly without waiting for him to ask more questions. Chenyin. When Duke Wei chased after him, he saw Xu Chenyin taking a taxi and leaving. He couldn't help but sigh low and say, "This child." At the same time, Xu Chenyin sat in the back of the taxi, watching the scene flashing by the window, her heart trembling with fear. Everything she would face was an unknown state. She didn't know if Ji Yan was on tonight's flight, nor did she know what attitude Ji Yan would have towards her, whether it was indifference or indifference, even after seeing Ji Yan. She is unaware. But now she is very clear about her heart. She finally saw Ji Yan again, and this time, she will walk towards Ji Yan without hesitation, even if the process will be very difficult. The driver in front thought she was catching a flight and comforted, "Little girl, my driving skills are among the best in Dulin. Don't worry, I will definitely deliver it to you in 10 minutes. Xu Chenyin chuckled lightly and explained silently. Upon arriving at the airport, Xu Chenyin paid the money and turned to run towards the boarding gate. The airport in Dulin County was not large, and the foot traffic was even less at night. In no time, Xu Chenyin arrived at the boarding gate. She stopped and looked around at the empty space, panting lightly and stunned. Is Ji Yan not here? Or did she miss it? Just as Xu Chenyin was feeling lost, a familiar voice suddenly came from behind. Xu Chenyin. It's Ji Yan. Xu Chenyin suddenly turned around and saw Ji Yan wearing a white shirt, standing a few meters away from her, with a solemn face and thin lips pursed into a line, exuding a sense of distance from others. The two of them stared at each other, but neither of them spoke. At this moment, there are only the two of them in the empty airport. Finally, Xu Chenyin couldn't help but speak and murmured, "I thought you had already left." When Ji Yan touched the wound on her index finger, his black eyes sank slightly and he said in a soft voice, "Come here." Xu Chenyin was momentarily stunned, but before she could ask more questions, Ji Yan had already turned around and had to run to keep up. She originally thought that Ji Yan would say some cold words to her again, and she had been doing psychological construction all the way, but when Ji Yan walked out of the pharmacy with a band-aid, she suddenly forgot all her reactions. Just foolishly watching Ji Yan disinfect her wound and gently apply a bandage for her. Ji Yan. Xu Chenyin's long eyelashes trembled a few times, and she looked up at Ji Yan. Her lips moved slightly, as if she was about to stop speaking. Ji Yan took care of her wound before lifting his eyelids and calmly saying, "What's up?" His tone remained cold, but Xu Chenyin inexplicably breathed a sigh of relief. "Are you leaving tonight?" Ji Yan let out a faint, Xu Chenyin lowered her eyes and remained silent. The carriage fell into a brief silence. Ji Yan occasionally glanced at the woman next to him, looking at her slightly reserved appearance, and a dark light flashed through his eyes. After a moment, both of them spoke at the same time. It's impossible between us," Ji Yan interrupted her without any waves on her face, saying word by word, "Xu Chenyin, I hope you can understand this." Upon hearing this, Xu Chenyin's heart suddenly throbbed. She bit her lip and couldn't say a word. Almost the next second, Xu Chenyin's phone rang. She glanced at the contact person displayed on the screen and wanted to hang up, but heard Ji Yan's cold voice say, "Come on, I told you, I don't care about the past anymore." Xu Chenyin's breath was slightly suffocating. After all, she still didn't answer the phone call. Perhaps Ji Yan really didn't care, but she couldn't do it. That incident was like a thorn piercing her heart, making her feel both guilty and resentful towards herself. At the moment when the call was hung up, another WeChat message popped up on the phone screen, and at the same time, Ji Yan could clearly see her phone wallpaper. It was during the summer vacation of their sophomore year in high school that they took pictures of the stars together. The stars in the wallpaper are still bright and dazzling, but in reality, the stars are already dim and lifeless. For a long time, Ji Yan withdrew his gaze and immediately raised his gaze, meeting Xu Chenyin's eyes. She is still beautiful, with stubbornness between her eyebrows, slightly red eyes, and a faint hint of tears. However, there is no longer the brightness of the past in those eyes, replaced by an indelible sadness. Ji Yan looked at her like this and his throat inexplicably tightened. After a while, he hoarsely said, "I'll take you back." As the car was driving on the road, Xu Chenyin's fingertips holding her phone turned a bit pale due to force. As the car arrived at the hotel entrance, Xu Chenyin lowered her eyelashes and slowly said, "Ji Yan, can I ask you a question?" Ji Yan's expression was indistinguishable. He lowered the car window, casually took out a box of cigarettes from his pocket, drew one, and held it with his slender fingers, then lowered his head to light it. In an instant, the faint firelight cast a hazy reflection on his appearance. Xu Chenyin stared at his profile with a deep gaze, hesitated for a moment, and mustered the courage to ask, "Did you come into contact with this industry because of our previous agreement?" Because she had said in high school that she would probably work in this field, and at that time she even asked Ji Yan about his preferences, but Ji Yan didn't answer. But she made a promise with him on her own. During the noisy break, she looked at the warm young man beside her and tentatively said, "Ji Yan, if you haven't figured out where to go yet, how about choosing a cultural relics major with me?" The young man smiled and rubbed her hair with his hand, saying, "Okay." However, on the eve of the college entrance examination, she left, and her youth's aspirations were ultimately unknown. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Anxiety and Disruption. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Anxiety and Disruption. Facing her hot and anxious gaze, Ji Yan's expression did not change much, and his voice, Upon receiving his affirmative answer, Xu Chenyin's heart suddenly paused. However, before she could say anything more, Ji Yan took the lead and spoke in a cold voice, "Xu Chenyin, this doesn't mean anything. Besides, I hope you can go as far as you used to, the better." Xu Chenyin's hand hanging on her side suddenly became cold. She looked up and looked at Ji Yan's eyes, her lips moved, wanting to ask him what he meant. But as soon as she started, she suddenly didn't know how to ask. His attitude is too decisive. Make her feel that it's really impossible between them. This cognition caused a sharp and sour sensation to surge in Xu Chenyin's chest. She lowered her eyes and smiled bitterly, with a hint of desolation in her eyes. She whispered, "Ji Yan, I know you hate me in your heart now, but Ji Yan, over the years, Xu Chenyin." Ji Yan suddenly interrupted her words, his black eyes slightly heavy, and his tone mixed with a hint of impatience. "How difficult do you want me to say to understand?" "Ji Yan, Xu Chenyin's heart froze as she looked up at Ji Yan's eyes, her eyes complex. Ji Yanji looked straight into her eyes, his voice clear and crisp. "Get off the car." Xu Chenyin hesitated for a moment, her eyes glistening, and she wanted to say something, but in the end, she pushed the door open and got off the car. She stood in the cold wind, her figure thin, watching the car fly away, and painfully closed her eyes. As she turned around, Marquis Wei stood behind her for an unknown amount of time. Seeing her disheartened appearance, he let out a light sigh and comforted her, saying, "Chenyin, good child. Just resolve the misunderstanding with Captain G." Xu Chenyin lowered her eyes and tried to conceal the hazy look of her tears. She murmured softly, "Master, I've caused you trouble." Duke Wei shook his head with a worried expression in his eyes, but he didn't know how to persuade him. He could only slowly say, "No trouble, let's go back first." Xu Chenyin nodded slightly, and when she returned to the door of the room, she heard Wei Ho's concern and said, "Chenyin, if her condition is not right, then she will take a day off tomorrow." "No need." Xu Chenyin took a soft breath, looked up, and tried to smile, "Master, don't worry, I won't bring my personal emotions into work." After hearing her say so, Duke Wei couldn't say anything more. He looked at her still red eyes and reminded her to rest early before turning around and returning to his room. At the moment of returning to the room, Xu Chenyin didn't turn on the lights and felt like she had completely lost her strength. She leaned against the door panel and couldn't regain her senses for a long time. For an unknown amount of time, it wasn't until a sudden phone call rang that her mind was awakened. It's Chen Lin, who was also the only classmate she had contact with in high school. "Chenyin, are you coming to next month's classmate gathering?" Xu Chenyin remained silent, and before she could answer, Chen Lin continued, "Busy people, everyone is thinking about you." Xu Chenyin wanted to refuse, but Chen Lin said slowly, after hearing Li Yu say something, "He seems to have contacted Ji Yan and is trying to persuade him." Xu Chenyin held her phone and lowered her gaze in contemplation. Chen Lin thought to herself, "This is the first time in all these years since graduation that I have been able to contact Ji Yan." At that time, something so big happened at his family, and everyone thought Ji Yan would be depressed, but they didn't expect. Halfway through, she suddenly realized something and comforted, "Chenyin, I don't mean anything else. If you don't want to come, then forget it." Listening to her words, Xu Chenyin didn't answer anymore, just changed the topic and said, "Where is the party address? Can you send me the location on my phone?" After hanging up the phone, Xu Chenyin lowered her eyes and looked out at the night, stunned for a long time. The work of restoring artifacts is repetitive day after day, which is dull and enjoyable. The restoration of the golden Hu bottle has a different significance for Xu Chenyin, as it is her first cultural relic to participate in the full restoration process. During this process, she once again felt the life story of the former owner of the golden Hu bottle. The owner of the golden Hu bottle was once a trusted vassal of the emperor, and it can be said that he had unlimited glory. At that time, the drinking culture was prevalent in the Tang dynasty. From the emperor to the people, almost all social classes in the Tang dynasty drank alcohol. Therefore, during this period, there were many wine shops and flag pavilions in Chang'an City. Among them, Huji Donglu and Huji Persuades Wine are the most popular, and the owner of the golden Hu bottle met a Huji during this process, got to know and fell in love with Huji, and also learned that Huji's family situation was not good. Originally, everyone thought that the courtier was playing with Huji, but they didn't expect that the courtier had moved his heart and didn't care about the strange looks of the world, running around for Huji. Just as the two were about to achieve their desired results, Huji disappeared. No matter how much the courtier searched, there was no result. The courtier's mother advised, but the courtier could not listen to anything. Day after day, year after year, until the courtiers had white hair, on their deathbed, he still remembered Huji and remained alone. With the passing of the courtier, Huji only appeared that year. At this time, Huji had already lost her beauty. She just held the golden Hu bottle that the courtier loved the most during his lifetime and murmured absent-mindedly, "If only I had been braver back then, I would have been willing to resist my family for you." Be braver. Xu Chenyin sat on the plain, looking at the white clouds outside the window. Ji Yan's figure and his indifferent words came to mind. Every word he said was forcing her to leave, but she didn't want to leave any more regrets with him. She would do her best to make up for the past and handle the difficult things she had to face in the future calmly. Even if the outcome is the worst, then, she still cannot retrieve Ji Yan's heart, and she will not have any regrets. At least she has worked hard before. When the plane landed, it was already 3 a.m. After parting ways with Duke Wei, she stopped a taxi and reported the address of the apartment. When she returned to the apartment and lay in bed after washing up, the sky was already hazy and gradually brightening. She lowered her eyes and looked at the photo with Ji Yan placed on the bedside table, couldn't help but sigh lightly. When she closed her eyes, what appeared before her was Ji Yan's skillful cigarette lighting movements. She remembers standing in the hallway of the teaching building on a sunny afternoon in her sophomore year, looking up at the young man's warm and smiling expression, and curiously asking, "Ji Yan, will you smoke in the future?" For her question, although Ji Yan didn't understand, he still answered seriously, "I don't think so. If there is smoking, it should be when I am very upset. I only smoke when I'm upset." Xu Chenyin lay in bed, tossing and turning with the voice of Ji Yan in her ears. It wasn't until sunrise that she unconsciously fell asleep. At the same time, inside the inpatient department of the Beijing hospital, Ji Yanjing stood at the end of the corridor, leaning against the cold wall, listening to what the person on the other end of the phone was saying. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Traces of Lying. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. Traces of Lying. Yan Gu, you haven't come for 3 years, my classmate. On the other end of the phone, Li Yu was constantly persuading, everyone is looking forward to you coming, and if you were worried about Xu Chenyin, she would definitely not come, after all, she. Ji Yanwei furrowed his eyebrows and said without saying a word, "Let me think about it again. There's something else to do, let's hang up for now." After hanging up the phone, Ji Yan leaned against the cold wall and looked at the bustling hallway, feeling a wave of annoyance. He was about to take out his cigarette box from his pocket, but suddenly remembered something. His hand hanging on his side tightened and he walked back into the third ward on his left. The work of an antique restorer is 8 in the morning and 5 in the evening, and one cannot be late or leave early. On the weekend, when Xu Chenyin arrived at the party box, almost all of her classmates were present. She instinctively glanced at the box, but there was no Ji Yan. Xu Chenyin's hope in her heart was completely extinguished, and she became familiar with her former classmates. Just as she was about to sit alone in the corner, Zhao Yu walked up with a glass in his hand and said in an unfriendly tone, "Did you really come?" His words immediately caused everyone in the private room to sigh. Li Yu was extremely disgusted with Xu Chenyin because of that incident back then. In Li Yu's words, he felt unworthy for Ji Yan and genuinely fed the dog. Chen Lin quickly stepped forward to mediate, "Chenyin, don't pay attention to him, let's play with us." Xu Chenyin lifted her eyes and gave Zhao Yu a faint glance, without any intention of replying. The reason why she came today was simply because she had a slight expectation in her heart. Now that the expectation has been extinguished, she just wants to go home quickly. Li Yu looked at her back and walked towards the corner, chuckling softly, "I really don't have self-awareness. If I were you, I would stay in the United States now and never come back." Upon hearing his words, Xu Chenyin's back stiffened. Just as she was about to turn around and refute something, she was interrupted by Chen Lin. "Chenyin, don't pay attention to him, he just yawned like that." Xu Chenyin lowered her eyes, concealing the complex emotions flowing in her eyes, and made a soft sound. Seeing the smell of gunpowder dissipate, the crowd in the private room suddenly became bored and began to gather together, chatting enthusiastically. Xu Chenyin sat quietly in the corner. Just as she picked up her glass and took a sip of her cocktail, the door of the private room was pushed open again, bringing in a faint yellow light. She glanced casually. It was also this glance that completely stunned her. "Yan Gu." At the moment Li Yu saw Ji Yan, he instinctively glanced at Xu Chenyin sitting in the corner, raised his eyebrows, and asked with a smile, "I thought you wouldn't come." "I came today when I had nothing to do." When Ji Yan said these words, there was no emotion on his face, as if it was really as he said. But Xu Chenyin watched Ji Yan without blinking, as he was quickly surrounded by a crowd. She couldn't help but think of the scene when she first saw Ji Yan in high school. In the autumn of that year, a freshman in high school reported that she was unfamiliar with the roads in Beijing because she had just returned from the United States. By the time she arrived at school, most of her classmates had already arrived and were scattered into small groups chatting enthusiastically. For this scene, she tried several times to blend in, but ultimately ended in failure. Just as she was about to turn around and leave, it was Ji Yan who stopped her. "Classmate, do you still have an answer to your question?" The bright sunshine fainted on the delicate face of the young man, making him look more clear and graceful. Xu Chenyin stared at him, hesitated for a moment, and then shook her head. "Do we still need to discuss together?" Ji Yanqian smiled and asked. At this moment, the eyes of everyone in the class were all focused on Xu Chenyin, including those who looked at him, those who were hostile, and those who were curious. Xu Chenyin's nervousness suddenly surfaced in her heart, and she lowered her eyes and shook her head. She refused, and the young man was not angry either. He just shrugged and smiled. "My name is Ji Yan. If you need help in the future, you can come to me." Warm and considerate, a graceful young man, this was Xu Chenyin's first impression of Ji Yan. At that time, she never thought that there would be so many interactions with Ji Yan in the future. Perhaps her gaze was too fixated, and in the private room, Ji Yan easily noticed her. A few seconds later, he withdrew his gaze and chatted with everyone in a harmonious atmosphere, as if nothing had happened. Xu Chenyin stared at Ji Yan's flawless side face, her heart beating fiercely. "Ji Yan, come on, let's have a drink and keep in touch more in the future." After a round of pleasantries, Ji Yan didn't even glance at her again after the party ended. Recently, the weather in Beijing has been unpredictable. Before she came, she even took a look at the weather forecast and found that there was no rain. Only a few hours had passed, and by the time she came out again, the rain had already started to rise and fall. Xu Chenyin looked at Ji Yan, who was the same person not far away, with a hesitant expression. Time passed by little, and the rain showed no signs of abating. Xu Chenyin had just mustered up her courage and was about to step towards him when she saw Ji Yan taking the umbrella handed over by the staff and walking towards her with his slender legs. She was momentarily frozen in place. Ji Yan handed her the black umbrella he had propped up, with no expression on his face. He said indifferently, "Don't you watch the weather forecast before going out?" Xu Chenyin's gaze fell on his face, murmuring softly, "Before I left, the weather forecast was cloudy." Upon hearing her words, Ji Yan let out a and didn't ask any more questions. He stepped up and prepared to leave. "Ji Yan." Xu Chenyin caught up with him, looked up at his deep eyes, pursed her lips and whispered, "Can you add a contact information?" After saying this, she realized something again and quickly added, "Don't worry, I definitely won't disturb you." Rainwater dripped onto the umbrella surface, making a crisp sound. Ji Yan didn't answer immediately, just stared at her quietly. Xu Chenyin was tense and waiting for his answer. After a long time, Ji Yan moved his Adam's apple and said in a slightly cold voice, "Xu Chenyin, I need to say it a few times before you can understand that your appearance now is a disturbance to me." Upon hearing his words, Xu Chenyin's face turned white and her gaze became blurred. She looked into his eyes, trying to find a trace of his lying. But there's nothing. After Ji Yan finished speaking, he bypassed her and left without any attachment. Xu Chenyin stood still, watching his back disappear into the vast rain, his heart piercing fiercely, tears streaming down her cheeks. After a long time, she closed her eyes and tried to adjust her emotions. After that night, Xu Chenyin inevitably fell ill. One illness lasted for half a month. During this time, Jiang Yu came to see her and told her some interesting things, including Wei Ho's worried fear of her resignation. Xu Chenyin only smiled a little after hearing this. Just a few days after she returned to the studio, Wei Ho gave her a task, saying that the TV station invited them to explain knowledge, and they couldn't shirk it. They had to go alone, which was the intention of the superiors and also to promote the protection of national cultural relics. End of this chapter. Chapter 10. First Love. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10 First Love. So, after everyone's vote, this public job was handed over to Xu Chenyin, who was recuperating at home at that time. In Zhang's words, it is. Chenyin has such a beautiful length, and there is no one who is more suitable than Chenyin in terms of professional knowledge. After learning this news, Xu Chenyin felt somewhat helpless, but could only grit her teeth. In the studio, the host was chattering on about the past experiences of exhibiting antiques, while Xu Chenyin stood silently watching from the side. Until the host brought the topic to her, she slowly said, the owners of this porcelain vase were a young couple who went from being ignorant and affectionate to having gray hair. In the feudal society of the past, under the system of 3 wives and 4 concubines, the male protagonist never took a concubine and spent his whole life with his first wife. Wow, the host applauded and praised, love in pairs, it's actually a perfect match, it's really enviable. Xu Chenyin nodded in agreement. When she first encountered these porcelain bottles and felt the life of the former owner of the cultural relics, she was also envious from the bottom of her heart. From childhood to the end, we will be together for a lifetime. This kind of love should be what most people aspire to. She couldn't help but think again, if nothing like that had happened between her and Ji Yan, would it be time to smoothly get back on track now? The host noticed her distraction and asked with a smile, many of us are not very familiar with the profession of cultural relic restorer. This profession is also relatively niche. Can Miss Xu introduce the general work of cultural relic restorer to our audience? Okay. Xu Chenyin snapped back to his senses and spoke slowly. Our daily work is basically to first understand the properties of the cultural relics that need to be restored, establish records for the cultural relics, and record the detailed process of cultural relics restoration in detail. Then we hold seminars, specifically on what field each person is responsible for. However, before all newcomers get started, they will learn from their master for a period of time. The host nodded seriously and said, so, how long is the restoration period for that cultural relic? It's possible for months to years. How are cultural relics rated? This is closely related to the preservation of historical traces of cultural relics during restoration. That really requires a lot of effort. After asking a question, the host looked at Xu Chenyin with a hint of appreciation in her eyes and said, there is another question that I want to ask for male friends. Does Miss Xu have a boyfriend now? Xu Chenyin was somewhat surprised by this question, but out of courtesy and facing the camera, she could only smile lightly and shake her head, not yet. The host joked to the camera, all the male friends in front of the TV, you need to hurry up. As the host finished speaking, a burst of cheers came from the audience. Xu Chenyin's eyebrows twitched slightly, and as the camera faced her again, she picked up the microphone with a smile on her face, but her words were serious. Although I am single, there is already someone in my heart. It was my first love, and now I am also chasing him back. You can just skip me. As soon as she uttered these words, the scene was instantly filled with laments. The host seemed to be surprised for a moment, but her reaction was extremely fast. Following her words, I didn't expect such an excellent person as Miss Xu to pursue people. Xu Chenyin's eyelashes trembled slightly, and she forced a smile. She whispered, he's better than me. After she finished speaking, there was no intention of continuing this topic, but she brought the topic back to cultural relics. The host was also interested and did not continue to ask further questions. The following program returned to the right track, and Xu Chenyin slowly entered a state of mind, quietly explaining the story behind each cultural relic. This is an object from the Song dynasty, placed in the heavenly uterus. Her voice flowed slowly, making everyone present's gaze fall on her, as if she had been introduced into that period of history. After the program was recorded, the sky was already dark. Xu Chenyin came out of the TV station and watched a pair of loving young couples pass by her. She couldn't help but think of Ji Yan's indifference towards her, and that sour feeling once again surged uncontrollably in her heart. She breathed a light sigh and took out her phone from her bag. Based on her memories of that day, she entered 11 digits into the WeChat friend add section. Immediately after, the WeChat page redirected to a person's profile page. The avatar is a selfie of him and the sea. Xu Chenyin almost instinctively thought, is it the sunken ship bay in Zijinsos that she has always wanted to go to? With this idea in mind, she nervously clicked on the portrait photo. When I saw that iconic sunken ship, she breathed faintly, forgetting all her reactions, leaving only shock. Ji Yan went alone to the place they had agreed to go together. For a moment, Xu Chenyin's heart was filled with mixed feelings, unable to conceal her sadness and sorrow. She stared at the photo for a long time before slowly regaining her senses. Looking up at the bustling streets, she suddenly felt a little relieved. Ji Yan has gone. Does it prove that Ji Yan still has her in her heart? But after a moment, she laughed at herself again. After that incident, she left Ji Yan, and now she has no right to fantasize about these things. The evening breeze blew slowly, and she sighed lightly, trying to suppress the surging emotions in her heart. After much thought, she pressed the add button with her fingertips on the screen. At the moment she pressed the add button, her heart suddenly began to beat with fear. Xu Chenyin closed her eyes, simply turned off the screen, stopped thinking about it, and walked quickly towards the subway station. When she returned to the apartment, the lights had no time to turn on. Standing at the entrance of the entrance, the first thing she did was open WeChat. Looking at the WeChat interface without any fluctuations, Xu Chenyin's eyes moved slightly and she stood still for a moment before forcing herself to wake up, put down her phone, and go to the bathroom to take a shower. After taking a shower, Xu Chenyin looked up at the electronic watch hanging on the wall. Time: 9:21. No matter how busy he is, he should be able to check his phone now, right? After comforting herself, Xu Chenyin walked to the entrance again, picked up the phone placed on the cabinet, hesitated for a moment, and suddenly pressed the screen button. Coincidentally, a WeChat message popped up on the phone page, but because she had set privacy, the content of that WeChat message could not be seen on the screen. Is it Ji Yan? It should be Ji Yan, otherwise who else would be so late? Xu Chenyin was lost in thought as she walked from the foyer to the sofa. Just as she sat down to open WeChat, she suddenly stood up and walked towards the balcony. She thought that if the news didn't come from Ji Yanfa later and let the cold breeze blow from the balcony, she could calm down and not sit on the sofa feeling lost. With this thought in mind, Xu Chenyin lit up her phone screen again and, feeling uneasy, opened the WeChat interface. End of this chapter.